I am Eleanor Lucas, now program chairman of the Larchmont Historical Society, and this program is being presented by Sidney Astle. A native of England, Sidney is now an American citizen who is devoted to American history, and especially to the history of Larchmont and its residents. He served for 4 years as a trustee of the village of Larchmont, and he has served for 6 years as a trustee of the Historical Society, 2 of those years as program chairman. Now, he has given us several outstanding programs. Wish You Were Here, a history of Larchmont told through postcards, A Small Hotel, a well-documented history of hotels and rooming houses in the early days of Larchmont's development, and then a tender tribute to Philip Severin, a prominent and beloved lifelong resident. Now, when I asked Sidney to do a program on women in Larchmont, he readily agreed, but he chose the more alliterative title, Larchmont Ladies. Sidney, I think our viewers would be interested to know how a person with your accent and background has become so interested in Larchmont and especially the Historical Society.
Well, frequently I'm asked, as you just said, how is it that someone with your accent is telling us about Larchmont history? My joking answer to that is that if Alistair Cook can do it, I can at least try. So that's what I did. But seriously, the real answer is that I became interested in Larchmont history, particularly through collecting postcards. I found a postcard at an antique fair one day that had the site of our present house. So from that I began to collect a series of cards, and through that I met Philip Severin. And Philip Severin, it happens that his father, the name then was Viren, it was Jacobs Viren. Jacobs Viren had the local stationery shop, and he published all of the postcards in Larchmont. So we had the strange situation where Philip would know the names of the people on the cards, and he was able to tell me a great deal of the history of Larchmont. And he brought it to life by stories of the people that were in Larchmont. So I feel that what has been particularly interesting, and I think the Historical Society does a great job in making people aware of where we came from. We may not always know where we're going, but we know where we came from. And to me, that is what made Larchmont what Larchmont is today.
Well, I remember hearing and seeing one of your early programs, and you called the American Revolution the Rebellion. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Well, that was just a question of pulling your legs. In fact, I remember what I actually said was Larchmont during the Revolution or during the Rebellion, depending on where you learned your history. No, I like to have a little sense of humor with it all, but what is important to me is that the events are recorded and known. And I think the Historical Society, in what they do and in committing the Larchmont Times to tape in the library, is also an important situation.
Well, we've used that many times, and it is a wonderful tool to have. Well, I think perhaps now we should go to our program. So here is Sidney Astle, our British import.
Now, it's particularly appropriate to have this program on Larchmont Ladies introduced by this well-dressed young man who was featured on a postcard around 1915. We were also talking earlier about the people that I had met and spoken to about Larchmont history. They were people who had been resident of Larchmont for a long time and had a gift of making, to me, they had a gift of making Larchmont come to life by telling stories of residents and people who were involved. And foremost amongst those, of course, was Philip Severin, who's seen here with his wife Alice on their honeymoon in 1923. Philip was a sort of one-man historical society who did a great deal of promotion of the history of Larchmont, both in writing and in the tours that he gave and he guided around Larchmont. He, with his friend Sherman Totten, did a great deal to let us all know what had been happening in Larchmont in the early years. Then I also spoke with Florence Haviland, with Hugh Collins. Hugh Collins, his father founded the Collins removal business, and also with Bert Megan. Then, as you know, we have a very active historical society, seen here celebrating Larchmont during Prohibition, which was the subject of one of the society meetings. The society is also doing a great deal of interesting work, such as committing the Larchmont Times from the turn of the century to tape in the library. Now, it's been said that over the years, Larchmont has been particularly fortunate in having been blessed with any number of citizens who cared enough to shape a beautiful community. Now, but in the early years, the prominent citizens, at least on the surface, were men, because that was the way of the world at the time. Now, foremost amongst those who shaped Larchmont's history, not always with intentions pure enough to qualify for good citizenship awards, were first of all John Richbell, who purchased the land originally from the Indians with the intent of using the area as a base for smuggling operations against the British. Poor fellow. New York at that time, in 1661, was under the control of the Dutch, but unfortunately for Richbell, the British gained control of Westchester a few years later, so that his plan for using the safe harbor for a smuggling operation suddenly wasn't quite such a healthy place on which to base an illicit operation. The next owner of the Larchmont area was Samuel Palmer, who was a Quaker farmer. He lived with his wife Mary and their 6 sons in a farmhouse which was situated approximately where the public library now stands, on land acquired from Richbell's heirs about 1700. Samuel was to become the first supervisor of the town of Mamaroneck. Next came Peter J. Monroe, who was born in the J. Homestead in Rye in 1767 and became a very successful lawyer. Then by 1790, when he was only 23, he'd purchased land around the Palmer farmhouse and gradually added to it until he eventually owned all of the middle neck of Richbell's original purchase. Then about 1819, he built a large house, the Manor House, and planted larch trees to afford some protection from the noise and dust of the Boston Post Road. The lady of the manor was Peter's wife, Margaret. They had 3 children, one of whom, Henry, inherited the property on Peter's death in 1833, but was obliged to sell it in 1845 to settle his debts. The new owner was Edward Knight Collins, a shipping magnate. He was one of the richest and most notable men in the country. He was brilliantly successful in business and was also well connected by his marriage to Mary Ann Woodruff, whose father was a founder of the Chemical Bank. By all accounts, he was a fabulous entertainer, and he's generally credited with having coined the name Larchmont from the larch trees and his home on the hill. His U.S. mail steamship line consisted of the fastest and most luxurious ships afloat and competed fiercely with the famous Cunard line. In 1854, his steamer Arctic was lost in collision at sea with 318 lives, including Collins' wife, a son and his only daughter. Now, it's important to note that this particular boat is not the Arctic. This is the steamer Larchmont, which actually plied between Providence, Rhode Island and New York, and was also lost at sea in a collision with a loss of about 150 lives. But then, with the Collins line, shortly after the loss of the Arctic, the second ship, the Pacific, disappeared mysteriously, and that caused Congress to withdraw a generous subsidy, and in 1858 the line ceased to operate, and Collins Larchmont Manor was sold at auction in 1865. The new owner was Thompson J.S. Flint, another successful businessman who lived in New York City and summered in Larchmont. This is an 1865 map of Larchmont, which shows the buildings that were there at the time as shown as black squares, and there are very few. It is interesting to note that there was a railroad and a station, but there were very few houses. So Flint actually purchased this with the intent of subdividing it and developing it. Now, he and his wife, Mary Elizabeth, had 7 children, 2 of whom played a significant role in the development of Larchmont. The youngest son, Frederick, who was born in 1852, was very active in the formation of the Larchmont Yacht Club, later in village government and also the volunteer fire department. His youngest daughter, Helena, this is Helena with her nephews. His youngest daughter, Helena, born in Illinois in 1850, was without doubt the most outstanding and generous lady ever to live in Larchmont. Now, the success of Flint's enterprise was far from a foregone conclusion, because only a few years before, in 1854, a similar venture north of the Post Road had failed, despite the developers having borrowed the name of a well-known noble estate in England, Chatsworth, and having built a station in the woods in the recently completed New Haven line. The surveyor hired for the project carved his name Bryson and the date on the rocking stone, the most significant and oldest landmark in the area. Now, this stone really did rock, and it was in fact a landmark used by the as far back as the Indians, but it finally settled down when the road was put through. This is a postcard of the same area some 60 years later, when the area was still under development. Now, the Flint family had moved to Manhattan in 1864 from Illinois, and Thompson Flint had conceived the idea of a grain elevator in Chicago, and he was one of that city's leading businessmen. Then in 1865, the Collins estate came up for auction, the 333 acres, which was advertised by the auctioneer as unusual adaptability for building sites. And also they had mentioned that the property was an hour from 27th Street by the New Haven Railroad, and that the nearest station was New Rochelle. This is New Rochelle Station. But to get an idea of how far this was considered to be out in the country, there was a song, 45 minutes from Broadway, which talks about get off where they say New Rochelle, and they talk about how all the Hicks all live in that area. Now, New Rochelle was considered to be a big city compared with Larchmont. So if all the Hicks were in New Rochelle, you can tell what must have been the general attitude about people in Larchmont. We really were out in the country. But the auctioneer went on to say that a station had already been erected in the only half a mile from the place. That's the first station. And that also that for health, beauty of scenery, sea bathing, fishing and yachting, the place is really equaled. So 7 years later, Flint incorporated the Larchmont Manor Company and sold it 228 acres, which were promptly subdivided. Streets were laid out and they started to build. And the first buildings that they made were all around the shoreline, around the harbour. Here are some of the first sites, not always exactly the same building that was on the sites then. This is 108 Park. This is 90 Park, which definitely is not the same building as it was then. And the most outstanding of the old buildings that still exist in its almost in its old form was 1 Helena, which is of course the gingerbread house. Then at the same time, several areas were set aside for the use of the public. There was the present Fountain Square, which in 1872 was called Flint Park. Then there were 30 more lots were sold during the 1870s, but response was still not good. And by 1881, only 32 houses had been built, all south of Maple Avenue. Then a second stage of building. 2 Larchmont, 6 Helena, 18 Beach, and 25 Beach. And 30 more lots were sold during the 1870s, but response was still not good. Then there came a breakthrough. This is a postcard of Park Avenue around that time, where there was really not too much building. But in 1880, Frederick, who was now a keen sportsman at the age of 28, persuaded his father to allow a yacht club to be headquartered on Horseshoe Harbour. And he asked for it to be headquartered in the old boathouse, which at the time was also being used as a church. And they came to a deal that they could use the boathouse from midday on Sunday until midnight the following Saturday, and they were not in any way to interfere with church services. And they were charged a rent of $1 a year. They were there for a few years until they moved into actually via another building too, but eventually moved into the present yacht club where they're still headquartered. Now the yacht club began to hold social events, the race week, the regatta, a ladies' day at the regatta in 1896, and this began to attract wealthy residents of New York City to come to Larchmont and either to purchase lots from the Larchmont Manor Company or at least to sample the area. This is another race week in Larchmont in 1907. And the boats that came got bigger and bigger, and the yacht club flourished, and so did the Larchmont Manor Company. The activities also extended later from boating also to tennis. Then at the other side of the headland in Horseshoe Harbour, there were also social activities. This is Horseshoe Harbour on July the 4th in 1910. So that from this little clearing in the woods almost, there began to be very much of a social scene. Then at the same time, the services to supply the new activities in Larchmont began to develop. And this is the corner of Larchmont Avenue and the Boston Post Road. And it was about this time that the citizens, believing that they couldn't depend on the town of Mamaroneck for services, nothing really changed. A move was made to incorporate Larchmont as a village, and in September 1891 there was a vote to vote for the formation of a village. In order to comply with the requirements, the Larchmont had to be 1 square mile, so the boundaries were extended beyond the manor in order to comply with that requirement. Then in 1891 a vote was taken. 65 people voted for incorporation and only 1 against. And that might seem like a small turnout from a count of 959 residents that were taken that summer. But in fact at the time women couldn't vote, and a male had to be over 21 and to own property. So wives, families, servants and tenants were ineligible. Then also services for the developing yacht club and the residential area. This was the inside of the Cunest and Quigley market, which was on the corner of Larchmont Avenue and the Post Road. Soon after the turn of the century, though, there was a devastating fire, and the whole of the shopping area that was here then was ruined. But not too long afterwards, everything was rebuilt, and you'll notice there that there was Jacobs Viren's stationery shop. He was the person who published most of the postcards I mentioned earlier. And during this period of growth, the Larchmont Land Company acquired the Chatsworth station and had also built the horse railway to service the manor. There's the station and the horse railway van waiting for for arriving passengers to take them home. There was one of the luxurious carriages of the Larchmont Horse Railway. things didn't always go smoothly as this photograph shows. Maybe commuting was just as difficult in those days. It was about this time that the boarding house boom hit Larchmont. It started by, apparently by a few ladies who wanted to open up their homes for paying guests. And one of the first was the Rose Cottage, operated in a small way by a Mrs. Oscar LaGrange. Then in about 1891, this establishment was purchased by Mary Bevan. She had it renovated and extended, and by 1893 the Bevan house was complete. One of the earliest and most celebrated guests was Louisa Drew, who was the matriarch of the Barrymore clan, and she died in the Bevan in 1897. And there is a stained glass window to her memory in St. John's Church. The Bevan house went through a few other structural changes over the years. Then another hotel or another boarding house was the Mitchell House, run by Harriet Mitchell. She acquired title to her land in 1887. At the time there were 2 small buildings on it, but she added 2 more, one of considerable size and obviously the main house. Now the Mitchell House stood just behind Horseshoe Harbour. You can see it through the trees there. That's a postcard of Horseshoe Harbour, and that's the Mitchell House in the background. The claim was that they were opening these premises as a private hotel or boarding house, as a quote, for the entertainment of gentlemen and their families who desired to spend the heated term in the country. So there are the families being entertained outside of the Mitchell House. And this was a postcard, the heated term in the country. I think that the designer of the postcard used a little poetic license. I don't think we were quite that far out in the country. But then a third and even more controversial lady appeared on the scene in the personage of a Mrs. Wilcox, who, as Mrs. May Sharman, had run a hotel on the point called the Hoboken Turtle Club in the early 90s. Then in February in 1895, she purchased a lot and immediately erected a 4-story building. This is it. And this sprung up overnight, 150 feet long, and she proceeded to occupy it and to operate it as an hotel, the Royal Victoria, the very same summer. The Royal Victoria was a very grand-looking hotel. But some of the postcards were also taken very skillfully. There's one, for example, which gives the impression that the Royal Victoria had Larchmont Sound almost on its doorstep. There obviously was a road in between the Victoria and the Sound. Philip Severin described Mrs. Wilcox as both looking and dressing like Queen Victoria. And Hugh Collins remembered her as a tough taskmaster. He said that if he arrived with some trunks to be taken up to the attic, even though there was an elevator in the building, Mrs. Sharman would make him walk all the way up the stairs with the trunks on his back. Now, it's also important to note at this time that the Flints themselves used the manor house as a boarding house for the entertainment of guests who were potential buyers. That all had an important bearing on some court cases at a later date. These actually were some of the outhouses of the Royal Victoria and the Mitchell House that caused such a problem in later times. In fact, in 1895, the New York Times reported problems existing in Larchmont under the headline, "Larchmont Hotel Owners Indignant." This referred to opening shots of a battle that was ongoing for many years. The hoteliers accused the residents of Larchmont Manor of, and this is a direct quote, of trying to surround themselves with a sort of golden wall and to have altogether erroneous ideas about individual rights. The report goes on to say that Larchmont Manor is particularly attractive now. The maples are gorgeous. There is scarcely a single object in the whole place to offend the eye. The only thing that disturbs the perfect harmony is the vexed boarding house and hotel question. In the very early days, the Larchmont residents, or at least the manor company, were concerned about the number of theatrical people who were becoming involved, and they deliberately steered their clients in a different direction. Now the residents were concerned about a growing transitory population and proceeded to try to shut down the hotels or boarding houses that did exist and to ensure that there were no more that would be built. Their prime defense was that most deeds in the manor contained a clause forbidding any commercial use, and they were justifiably jealous of the area in which they lived, if only for the summer. And as a result of all this, May Sharman was involved in a lawsuit with Frederick Flint, who owned a lot next to her, the new Royal Victoria. Harriet Mitchell was in dispute with the leading citizen, Jose de Lima, who was to become village president. That was the forerunner of mayor. And the establishment in the form of, quote, the committee in charge of the enforcement of the Larchmont Manor Covenant claimed complete victory. A very grand letter to an unknown recipient says, "No one will be tempted hereafter to destroy the character of the village, which has steadily been developing as a place of residence occupied by people of wealth and refinement, and it behoves us all to see that this high character is maintained, and to that end we must be ever watchful and discourage in every way any act which may tend to destroy that which has been built up through many years of great expense and effort, namely an ideal place for homes, full of attractions, and remarkably free from objectionable features." Maybe we should have that quote printed and handed to the village board. In truth, however, neither side won a clear victory. May Wilcox was allowed to continue the operation of the Royal Victoria because the court's finding was that the hotels or boarding houses that existed with the obvious support of the manor company, not only without the dissent of any, but patronized by many of the residents. More importantly, it was shown that Frederick Flint had been present during the building of the Royal Victoria and had raised no objection. Indeed, on one occasion, during a yacht club ball, he'd actually been known to offer to sell his cottage to Mrs. Wilcox as an annex for her hotel. So they lost the case as far as the hotels were concerned, but the hotel people were ordered to stop using outhouses as restaurants and only to serve food and liquor to residents or their invited guests. But the residents didn't take very kindly to that, and for many years there was an ongoing argument. In fact, shortly after the court case, the Mitchell House caught fire in December 1905, doing $30,000 worth of damage to the building and $10,000 to its content. But during the arguments that were going on, the hotels couldn't be shut down, but they were tolerated. But there were many objections that were raised and arguments ongoing. One of them was that a female patron of the bar at the Victoria was seen to raise her skirts to the indecent and scandalous height of her shoe tops. At the time, Douglas Fairbanks was making an early Western, and supposedly he was seen, he was staying at the Victoria, but supposedly seen lassoing neighborhood cats and dogs. Guests were also reported sneaking across the park for a dip in the Sound, in what was considered to be a completely indecent state of undress by the villagers. On the other hand, hotels such as the Belvedere, which is now the Manor Inn, and the Bevan continued to operate. And in fact, there were more hotels and restaurants were opened. This is the Blossom Heath Hotel. There was actually right where the Village Square shopping centre now stands. And that is the front gate of the Blossom Heath, going down the hill towards Weaver Street. This was the inside of the Blossom Heath. Note all of the plates and crockery stuck to the ceiling and around the room. Now, when the Blossom Heath burned down, there was apparently so much glass, molten glass, flowing out of the front door that the firemen, I was told it looked like ice running down the front steps. Now, the additional restaurants and hotels were all concentrated around the post road and away from the shore. So in a way, I suppose that Larchmont zoning was already being formed. And the Bevan continued. That's a postcard of the Bevan in the 50s. And then it really came to a halt in the 70s. In fact, it's interesting to note that when the Bevan first opened not when the Bevan first opened, but in about 1920, arrivals at the Bevan were noted in the Larchmont Times. And just before this period, departures from the Bevan were noted in the Mamaroneck Times, because they usually went away under police escort. So this is the way the Bevan deteriorated until a group of people took charge, and Larchmont owes them a great debt of thanks for turning the Bevan as it was into the Bevan as it is today. So the old committee in charge of the enforcement of Larchmont Manor Covenant would surely be proud of people who achieved this, particularly the Wolfendens, the Kavanaghs, with more than a little assist from the likes of Bruce Allen and Bill Plumas. So as Larchmont became built up and the yacht club became more prominent, most of those areas were still mainly under male influence, but there were one or two ladies in Larchmont who had a great deal of influence, and foremost amongst these, of course, was Helena Flint. She was born in 1850 and died in 1834. She came to Larchmont with her father as a permanent resident in 1873, and she divided her time between her homes in Larchmont and New York City and travelled widely. This is her home in Larchmont at 85 Larchmont Avenue. She called it Cherry Tree Cottage, and that was her main home. But she was in an independent social and financial position, was able to travel and also to exert more influence than most of her contemporaries. She also caused some land reclamation and built a causeway to it. It was known at the time as Miss Flint's Island. It's now Cedar Island. Then on one of her European tours in the early 90s, she became acquainted with Miss Harriet Hosmer, an American sculptor living in Rome and a noted pioneer, again in a field belonging almost exclusively to men. Helena prevailed upon her to create a statue and to come to Larchmont to supervise the placement of it. And it was placed in one of the parks set aside for it, now known as Fountain Square. This is a later picture of Fountain Square, which is of particular interest. This is one of the cards published by the Zvirin Company, and since the Zvirin family always knew where the photographer would be, they had a habit of putting on their best clothes and appearing so that they could be in the picture. And the lady on the extreme right is Dora, and the one in the middle is Helen Zvirin. Helen Zvirin is still alive in Florida. Then another activity of Helena Flint was the gardening club. She had actually surrounded herself with gentle, caring, artistic ladies, which resulted in other benefits. Now, for the gardening club, she gave a corner near the golf course, actually what is now part of Flint Park. That was the original golf house, which is now 44 Monroe, the home of Judge and Mrs. Clifford. It's been moved a few yards from the original site. This is a well-disguised Helena Flint. Her object in the gardening club was to encourage local children to learn to tend gardens and to provide fresh flowers and produce for sick and needy. And subsequent projects of the garden club have certainly enriched our community, and civic improvement is one of its objects of the Constitution. But without doubt, Miss Flint's major gift to Larchmont was 25 acres of land to be used as a children's park. The gift was made in 1913. Eventually the area was developed by the village, and in 1935 it was fully developed for play for children, and this fulfilled all of Helena's aims except one, which was public access to Long Island Sound. Now, I also had the pleasure of talking with Miss Florence Haviland, herself a remarkable character, and she was very lucid and mentally agile even at 91. And she remembers first visiting Miss Flint in 1897 at the age of 6. She visited with her Aunt Polly. She described Miss Flint as being awesome, wearing a starched shirt waster with pearls, and the occasion was a dinner at Cherry Tree Cottage in a huge dining table, under which there was a luxurious velvet footrest. So 6 huge Chesapeake oysters were served to the little girl, who was a bit dubious about their appearance. But when Miss Flint, she must have been very awesome, because when she said to the little girl, "What's the matter, Florence? Don't you like oysters?" the little girl promptly downed all 6. This is Aunt Polly, who was actually a wonderfully civic-minded lady, Emily Earl Lindsley. She was an artist and lived in a studio in a carriage house next to Miss Flint's mansion. And the two ladies worked on a number of projects together, including the Garden Club, later the League of Women Voters. But Miss Lindsley is best remembered for her work in establishing the Larchmont Avenue Church in 1914. At that time, there were only 2 churches in Larchmont, St. John's and a small Roman Catholic chapel at Beach and Linden. That had begun mainly as a place of worship, mainly for Irish Catholic servants of the large manor houses, but it was also an easy walk from Dillon Park in New Rochelle across the footbridge which existed at the time. Miss Lindsley was a Presbyterian minister's daughter, and she had visions of development, again north of the Post Road, now that the manor was more fully developed. And those were some of the early photographs and a postcard of Larchmont Avenue Church. But Miss Lindsley built a house north of the Post Road at 55 Chatsworth in 1897, because she could see Larchmont growing north of the Post Road, and she wanted to build a hotel. So this place was actually built as a hotel. The church made it, but the hotel didn't. And this house was then subdivided to form a 2-family residence. Emily Lindsley was a remarkable lady. She was still writing for the Westchester Historical Society Bulletin in 1923 at the age of 74. She was also seen driving around Larchmont when past 80, and driving was one of her favorite pastimes. She had actually driven ambulances during World War I in New York. Now, the activities of these 2 ladies, of these, I must say, 2 strongly spirited ladies, were all the more remarkable when you remember that at the time women didn't get the vote until 1920. And that was another campaign in which Emily participated. And this is a postcard of Premium Point. At one time, the Isolines lived here, and Florence told me that on one occasion during this campaign for universal suffrage, there was a bake sale, and one of the cakes at the sale had votes for women written in the icing, and Mrs. Adrian Islin gave a knife to one of the servants and said, "Please go and take the icing off that cake." So it seems as though not everyone was in favour of the campaign. Now, there have been many other notable ladies associated with Larchmont, such as the wealthy and 5 times married Amy Crocker-Gouraud. And she really lived the life of the gay 90s in the social world of New York. The first home she had was here, built on Oak Bluff in the 1880s, then destroyed by fire in 1904. And fire was an ever-present danger to these large wooden structures, particularly when there was water wasn't readily available. They then rebuilt the house, calling it the Hacienda, which became the Larchmont Shore Club. But as far as individuals are concerned, I still remember fondly my conversations with the young lady who had visited Miss Flint with her Aunt Polly. And this, of course, was Florence Haviland. Florence, she was an interesting character because during World War II, she wrote advertising copy about such manly things as motor car tires and chemicals. And she still remembers coming to Larchmont and describes it as the flowers that were abounded in large open fields. And she remembers driving through around by the shore. Now, when she was writing advertising copy in the First World War, she wasn't even allowed to go and meet the sponsors because sponsors wouldn't believe that a woman could ever write about such manly things as motor car tires and chemicals. But Florence wanted to become well, actually, she did become a cub reporter. She always wanted to write belles lettres and to starve in a garret in Paris, but she continued to go to work, to her job in New York City every day until she died at 91, and she remained very lucid right to the end. Other areas in which ladies featured very much was in the school districts, and one lady, not in the Larchmont School District, but in the New Rochelle School District, was Phyllis McGinley. She, as Mrs. Charles Hayden, lived in various places, 60 Beach and 12 Hazel Lane. In 1961, she won the Pulitzer Prize for a collection of poems, selected verses from 3 decades. She also wrote about Larchmont in A Short Walk from the Station and also the well-known I Know a Village. Then I was also fortunate to speak with a lady, Henrietta Adore, when she was 89. Henrietta was born in the United States but went to Switzerland for 5 years at the age of 5. She came back to Chatsworth in 1908 and went to the Chatsworth School. And she remembered the headmistress of Chatsworth School, a Miss Margaret Lynch. She was a much loved and highly respected teacher, and afterwards there's an old Chatsworth class. There's Miss Lynch, who afterwards became a lawyer, and the Larchmont Times of 1923 calls her modest and unassuming, and she was the first woman to argue a case in a Westchester court. In the article in the Larchmont Times, she was likened to a modern Portia, particularly when she won the case. Henrietta also remembers, or did remember, the teachers. She remembered the teachers' common room, which is at the front of the building. What she remembered particularly was that the teachers were not allowed to keep company. As Henrietta said, it was all done on the sly, and they used to flirt with the trolley conductors out of the window of the common room. But she did remember them as a wonderful bunch and terrific teachers. Then we have some more pupils in gym slips, including Ruth Greenwood. Her father actually drove the Manor trolley, and she lived in Larchmont her entire life, and later, as Ruth Chesborough, taught Murray Avenue School for almost 50 years. She retired in 1962 and died in December 1989, aged 92. And that's a 4th grade class at Chatsworth in 1925. And Ruth Chesborough is of course the teacher, but also of interest is the little lady on the left, the first on the left, who is actually Gloria Hattrick, who is now Mrs. James Stewart, and behind her is Anna Reisman, who supplied the photograph. Then this was the establishment that they all graduated to, the Mamaroneck High School. Now, Florence's father was a landscape gardener at the Mercadante estate, which is in the town of Mamaroneck, where Dante and Byron and all those streets are, off Weaver. And these are some shots of the old Mercadante estate. Then also, of course, we now have lady politicians, and we've come a long way since the turn of the century. Ladies don't just ask for the vote, they ask for our vote. So we have lady politicians, we have a lady mayor, Miriam Kernan, who wrote her own bit of Larchmont history and is still writing it. And what do you think these 1920 Larchmont policemen would have said had they known that in the not too distant future, one of the subjects for discussion on a police contract was maternity leave?
Well, thank you, Sidney, for allowing us to capture this program for future presentations. And a special thank you to LMC-TV and, of course, to Alan Rebuffo, who with infinite patience dealt with us this afternoon. Now, Sidney, we are most sorry that you're leaving us. Sidney is moving with his family for business reasons to a suburb of Philadelphia, a suburb with a Welsh name. Gwynedd?
Gwynedd, yes.
All right. I know you're going to come back to see us, and I hope you won't forget us.
Well, thank you, Eleanor. I am sure that I won't forget you either. I won't forget Larchmont or the Historical Society. I agree with you about great thanks to LMC-TV and Alan's patience. And we will be back often, particularly with the centenary coming up. And anything that we can do, or anything that I can do to help, it would be my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Sidney.